Guys, what's your wildest college story? My first year of university, I lived in the dorms, and one night a girl asked me to buy her some tequila. I didn't think much of it and agreed. I showed up at her place with a bottle of tequila and 7 beers, only to find that some of her friends were there too. We started doing tequila shots, but since I can't stand tequila, I was downing my beers to wash away the taste. Within 2 hours, the tequila was gone. My beers were finished, and my memory started to blur. The next morning, I pieced the night together from what others told me. Apparently, after we left her dorm, the group ended up back at my place. For reasons that escape me, I started making out with the least attractive girl in the group. Everyone else decided to call it a night and left us alone. One thing led to another, and I ended up sleeping with her. At some point during the chaos, I was in the bathroom trying to take off a rubber, struggling in my drunken state. My friend found me there and, rather than help, he just shook his head, told me to get back in the room and finish what I was doing. I complied. Then, my roommate came back, barging into the room without warning. He caught me in the act, fully engaged with this pint-sized disaster of a partner, and immediately turned around and bolted out. Embarrassed, I ran after him, still wearing nothing but the rubber. I chased him into another dorm room, which was full of about 6 people. There I was, standing fully bare except for a rubber, pleading with him to come back so I'd have an excuse to kick the girl out. To his credit, he eventually returned, and I was able to end that particular chapter of the night. But it didn't end there. Now free of my guest, I decided it would be a good idea to wander around the dorm unclothed, trying to get people to smell my fingers. Most people, understandably, declined, but I was persistent. At some point, I absent-mindedly rubbed my eye with the same hand, realized what I was doing, and then promptly grossed myself out. Eventually, I managed to find some pants and salvage what was left of the evening. I ended the night lying in bed next to a stunning blonde who was hand-feeding me M&Ms. The catch? She was feeding them to me with the very fingers I had been trying to get everyone to smell earlier. In hindsight, I can only marvel at how I managed to turn that night into such a chaotic series of events. Story 2. When I was in college in Minneapolis, I worked at a convenience store across the street from my apartment. One day, 2 Japanese girls came in, loaded up on ice cream, and we started chatting. I learned they were visiting from Osaka and weren't too fond of the girl they were staying with because they found her boring. On a whim, I invited them to see a local band at First Avenue that evening. They agreed, and we ended up having an incredible night. Afterward, we went back to my place to keep the party going. My buddy Mike, who had joined us, eventually went home, and as soon as I locked the door, the girls unexpectedly made a move on me. We hooked up, and I couldn't believe what was happening. Having a trio, let alone with 2 Japanese girls, felt like a surreal bucket list moment. Surprisingly, it wasn't as intimidating as I'd always imagined. At the time, my apartment was basically empty because I had recently thrown out all my furniture. Some jerk had left a good-looking couch by the dumpster, and when I brought it in, I discovered it was infested with bed bugs. That night, we crashed into a pile of blankets and sleeping pads after our fun. I was worried they'd be grossed out when they saw the state of my apartment in the morning, but they were totally cool about it. In fact, they hated staying with the girl they originally came to visit so much that they decided to move all their stuff into my bare-bones apartment and stay with me for the rest of their trip. During their time in Minneapolis, they were amazing. They cleaned my apartment, cooked incredible Japanese stew, and even bought me booze. When it was time for them to leave, I offered to drive them to the airport as a small thank you. On the way, one of them asked me to pull over at a furniture store, and to my shock, they bought me a futon bed. It was hands down the best thing that ever happened to me in college. Minami, and now, if you're out there, thank you for everything. Story 3. Freshman year, our dorm floor was all male, which was pretty typical for most freshman dorms, but we were fortunate enough to have an all-girls floor both above and below us. It created a fun dynamic and an endless source of entertainment. One of our favorite pastimes was hosting Super Smash Bros. Tournaments in Will and Joe's double room. These tournaments became a weekly tradition, drawing in the entire floor for epic 3-hour all-floor brawls. After one particularly intense game night, I decided to take a quick nap to recharge for the rest of the evening. 30 minutes later, I woke up feeling groggy and realized I had left my phone in Will and Joe's room. I figured I'd just walk over and grab it before doing anything else. As I approached their room, I casually opened the door, expecting a normal scene of some leftover snacks or someone playing a game. But what I walked into was anything but typical. To my surprise, Will and Joe were in the middle of some rather intense action. They were double-teaming 2 girls from the top floor. The girls were positioned on opposite sides of the room, and things were happening. My phone was lying smack in the middle of the room on the floor, as if the universe had just set it right there as a reminder that this situation was unfolding. I stood there for a moment, trying not to react too much, then reached down, grabbed my phone, and slid it into my pocket. Both Will and Joe, without skipping a beat, looked up and extended their hands toward me for a high five. I had no idea what to say, but my mind was in autopilot at that point. I raised both my hands like a cross, slapped their palms, and without saying a word, walked straight back out of the room. It was just one of those moments that you don't quite process until it's over. Story 4. I witnessed one of the wildest things the other day. There was this guy who decided to beer bong an entire fifth of Jack Daniel's whiskey. Before he even started, he turned to his friends with this completely serious look on his face and said, "All right, so when I'm done, we're going straight to the hospital." It wasn't a joke or a dare. It was like he knew exactly how this was going to end. Sure enough, he picked up the beer bong, tilted it back, and downed the entire fifth of Jack in one go. It was both horrifying and bizarrely impressive, but everyone standing around was clearly more concerned than amazed. As soon as he finished, he and his buddies didn't waste any time. They hopped in a car and headed straight to the hospital, just as he had planned. It was like they already knew he'd need his stomach pumped to survive this ridiculous stunt. The whole scene was a mix of chaos and oddly premeditated stupidity. You couldn't help but wonder what would drive someone to do something so dangerous and destructive on purpose. It wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision either. This guy knew exactly what he was doing, and apparently, so did his friends. Story 5. One night, a couple of girls on my floor were getting ready to go to a dance. They were all excited, trying on outfits, doing their hair, and putting on makeup. I decided not to join them since I had to be up early for work the next morning. Instead, I stuck around to help them out with hair, makeup tips, and whatever else they needed before heading back to my room. Once they were all set and had left for the dance, I decided to wind down and relax. I climbed onto my bed, picked a movie to watch, and settled in for a quiet night. Everything was normal until, out of nowhere, my door suddenly opened. To my complete shock, a random guy I'd never seen before walked in like he owned the place. He didn't say a word, didn't even look at me, just casually strolled in, shut the door behind him, and started taking off his pants. I was so confused and caught off guard that I just froze, unable to say anything at first. My brain was trying to process what was happening. Who was this guy? Why was he here? Why was he taking off his pants in my room? By the time his pants hit the floor, I finally snapped out of my stunned silence and managed to speak. In the calmest voice I could muster, I said, wrong room." He immediately stopped what he was doing, looked around like he was just realizing where he was, muttered some kind of apology, and hastily pulled his pants back up. Without another word, he opened the door and walked out, leaving me sitting there in stunned disbelief. It was such a bizarre moment, and even after he was gone, I couldn't help but replay the whole thing in my head, trying to figure out what exactly had just happened. All I could do was laugh at the absurdity of it and double-check that I locked my door for the rest of the night. Story 6. Back in college, one of my friends somehow managed to create the most outrageous and legendary stories. The first was born out of a ridiculous bet. A girl from our dorm bet him that if he could eat 18 ice cream Snickers bars in 30 minutes, she would give him a blowy. To everyone's surprise, and maybe horror, he took the bet seriously and got to work. With a small crowd gathered, he powered through the first few bars like a champ, but as the clock ticked, you could see the regret start to settle in. By the end, he looked visibly ill, but he somehow finished all 18 bars just in time. The room erupted in cheers, and my friend basked in the fleeting glory of his accomplishment, until the girl backed out of the deal. She laughed it off, claiming she didn't think he'd actually do it. So, all he got for his efforts was the admiration of his peers, a massive stomachache, and the dubious honor of being the guy who ate 18 Snickers bars. But that story pales in comparison to what came next. This same friend nearly got expelled for what can only be described as one of the dumbest pranks in dorm history. It all started when a girl on our floor decided to pull a prank on her roommate by putting her roommate's inners on someone else's door handle. Unfortunately, she mistakenly put it on my friend's door instead. When my friend and I noticed the cloth hanging there, we were both confused. "Huh, that's weird," I said. Then, without thinking, I jokingly blurted out, "It would be funny if someone shat on that cloth." What I didn't expect was for my friend to take me seriously. Without saying a word, he grabbed the inner, a plastic bag, and marched into the bathroom like a man on a mission. Minutes later, he emerged, victorious in his eyes, having crapped all over the cloth. At first, We thought it was hilarious in the dumb, immature way only college kids can. But then the cloth's owner, who wasn't even part of the prank, started going around the floor, frantically asking where her inner had gone. Seeing how upset she was and realizing she was involving the RA, it hit us. This was not funny anymore. It was a huge mistake. We decided to come clean. Unfortunately, since the RA was already involved, the situation had to be reported to student life, and it quickly escalated. The university administration determined that incident was apparently a crime worthy of potential expulsion. My friend had to face a student affairs trial, where he was forced to testify about the incident in front of a panel of university higher-ups. He had to explain why he did it and reflect on what he had learned from the experience. The whole ordeal was surreal. To support him, a bunch of people from our floor showed up to speak on his behalf. Even the girl whose inner was involved testified for him. While she was understandably confused and upset about the whole situation, she liked my friend and didn't want to see him get kicked out of school. Her support probably saved him because, against all odds, he wasn't expelled. Looking back, it's still one of the most absurd things I've ever been involved in. I'll never forget sitting in that trial, knowing the entire incident was sparked by a dumb offhand joke I made. My friend took it in stride, though, and even now, it remains one of those stories that everyone from our floor remembers and laughs about. Story 7. At the end of the semester, I invited a girl I'd been seeing on Tinder over for a low-key second date. We didn't have much privacy in our dorms because the setup was pretty communal. 3 guys in one room connected to another room of 3 guys via a shared bathroom. Luckily, one of my roommates had already gone home for break, and the other was cool enough to let me have the room for the night. The guys in the connected room were still around, but it didn't seem like a big deal at the time. The night started off fine. We were hanging out, just enjoying each other's company. At one point, she went to the bathroom, which was no big deal. Or so I thought. Unbeknownst to me, she was on her period and decided to flush her pad down the toilet, wrapped in a giant wad of paper towels. After she came back, we shut the bathroom door, put on a movie, and settled in for what I hoped would be a chill evening. A little while later, we started hearing some commotion coming from the bathroom. At first, I didn't think much of it, assuming the guys in the other room were just being rowdy. But then my phone buzzed with texts in our group chat, and my stomach sank. Her pad had clogged the toilet, causing it to overflow and flood the bathroom. Apparently, it had somehow ended up on the bathroom floor, much to everyone's disgust. What followed was nothing short of a dorm-wide crisis. A girl from down the hall had to step in and deal with the situation because none of the guys wanted to touch it. She used a coat hanger to pick the pad up off the floor and threw it in the trash. To make matters worse, they had to bleach the entire bathroom floor to clean up the mess. Meanwhile, I was still in the room, trying to figure out how to break the news to the girl I was with. When everything finally calmed down, I went into the bathroom to check the damage and apologize to the guys. They were understandably grossed out, but mostly just amused by the whole ordeal. Then came the hardest part, telling her what had happened. I tried to break it to her as gently as possible, but she was mortified. She kept apologizing, clearly embarrassed about the whole thing. In the end, though, we managed to salvage the night, and things got back on track. Let's just say she made up for the awkwardness in her own way before the night was over. It was definitely one of the weirdest dates I've ever had, but at least it makes for a funny story now. Story 8. During my senior year at a rural high school, prom night was followed by an after-party at a redneck hunting camp deep in the woods. About 40 of us showed up, and the event had all the hallmarks of small-town debauchery. Country music blaring, coolers full of beer, and enough questionable decisions to fill a lifetime. Among the attendees was a junior girl and her boyfriend, a couple infamous for their chaotic energy. As the night wore on, the two of them got absolutely smashed. At some point, the girl became laser-focused on our Argentinian exchange student. He was a good-looking guy, with the kind of charm that seemed almost exotic in our tiny town. In her drunken state, she decided that he was the most attractive man she had ever seen and that she was going to sleep with him. She dragged him away from the main crowd and over a hill, much to the laughter and whispered commentary of the rest of us. About 5 minutes later, though, the exchange student came walking briskly back to the group, his expression a mix of discomfort and panic. He muttered something along the lines of, "She wanted to do things I don't want to do," before quickly grabbing another beer and trying to blend back into the party. Not long after, the girl came waddling up the hill, completely bottomless. Her shirt and jacket were still on, but everything below the waist was gone, leaving her furry taco, as some later described it, on full display. She was crying, loud, drunken sobs, and slurring about how nobody wanted to sleep with her. It was one of those moments where you weren't sure whether to laugh, cringe, or run for cover. Then her boyfriend stormed up the hill. What followed was a drunken argument that will live forever in local lore. He yelled at her about her attempts to cheat on him, while she screamed back about how unsatisfied she was in their relationship. At one point, she shouted something about how he couldn't even last more than 2 minutes, which sent the onlookers into a mix of gasps and stifled laughter. Meanwhile, the exchange student wisely stayed out of sight, probably questioning every decision that had led him to that moment. Eventually, a group of girls stepped in, herding her away from the crowd and back toward the cabin. Someone found her pants and helped her put them back on while she continued to sob incoherently. She passed out shortly afterward, ending her chaotic contribution to the evening. Her boyfriend, on the other hand, stuck around long enough to get into another argument, this time with someone who had the audacity to laugh at his predicament. He eventually stumbled off, muttering curses, leaving the rest of us to drink, gossip, and try to move on from the spectacle. That night became infamous in our tiny community. For years, it was a story whispered among friends and recounted at bonfires, always met with laughter and disbelief. But time has a funny way of rewriting narratives. The boyfriend? He's now serving a life sentence in prison for offing his father about a decade ago. A shocking but, in hindsight, not entirely surprising turn of events. The girl? She reinvented herself as a pillar of the community. Today, she's the chair of the Town Betterment Committee, organizing events like the 4th of July parade, Halloween festivities, and the annual Christmas tree lighting. She's respectable, polished, and civic-minded, and no one dares bring up the night when half the senior class saw her wandering around bottomless, crying about her unfulfilled ambitions. May 1988. A simpler time, full of drama, scandal, and memories that will never make it into the official town history. Story 9. During college, I had a part-time job as the night manager for the campus coffee shop, and one of my responsibilities was baking all the cookies for the next day. One evening, after the shop was closed and my coworkers had left, my girlfriend stopped by to visit me. She playfully closed the door to the work area, revealing a bold surprise that left no room for doubt about her intentions. We ended up doing it on the work table where the cookies were usually prepared. Later that month, during a big college dance party happening nearby, we had another after-hours adventure in the coffee shop itself, making the night even more memorable. Fast forward to today. My adventurous girlfriend is now my wife, and we just celebrated 25 wonderful years of marriage. Story 10. One night, I was at a bar with some friends. While they headed off to grab shots, I stayed back to keep an eye on our table. Across from me, I noticed a stunning girl in a striking outfit and what appeared to be a collar, sitting alone at another table. She seemed to be doing the same as me, waiting. We exchanged a few glances, and when she smiled, I couldn't help but smile back. A moment later, she tapped the chair next to her, inviting me over. Excited, this sort of thing didn't usually happen to me. I eagerly joined her. The music was deafening, making conversation almost impossible. I tried to play it cool, tossing out bits of small talk and nodding along. Then, out of nowhere, she leaned in and kissed me without hesitation. I was thrilled and completely caught up in the moment. During a rare lull in the music, she leaned close and asked, "Do you want to get out of here?" Without hesitation, I said yes. Since this was the mid-90s, we left handwritten notes for our friends on the table and hopped into a cab. She handed the driver her ID for directions, and we spent the entire ride making out. Things were getting intense, but we arrived at her dorm before it went any further. Once inside her room, there wasn't much talking. We moved straight to her bed, and things escalated quickly. As we were getting it on, I noticed her breathing becoming heavier, so heavy it sounded like hyperventilating. Concerned, I paused to ask if she was okay, but she just pushed me back down, signaling that she was fine. I continued, even as her breathing shifted into an odd, sputtering sound that unnerved me a little. At one point, she pulled me up and whispered in my ear, asking if I had protection. Unfortunately, neither of us did. Disappointed, we couldn't take things all the way. By the end, her breathing sounded like an outboard motor. Exhausted, we both passed out shortly after. The next morning, she nudged me awake as she got dressed. Leaning over, she whispered, "You need to go. My roommates will be back soon." Still groggy, I opened my eyes, and that's when I noticed something I hadn't before. In the sunlight streaming through the window, I realized that what I thought was a collar all night wasn't a collar at all. It was a tracheostomy tube. The realization caught me completely off guard. Still, she seemed like an incredible person, and I couldn't help but feel it was a shame that things didn't go further. Story 11. One night during my freshman year, I was hanging out with a buddy in our dorm when we heard about a party in another dorm room. We decided to check it out, had a few beers, and then decided to get high. While we were there, a guy started asking around if anyone wanted to do mushrooms with him. I politely turned him down as he opened a bag and popped what looked like at least an eighth of mushrooms into his mouth. We stuck around for a while, but then someone suggested moving the party outside to the orchard next to the dorm to smoke cigarettes. About 20 of us headed out, but Mushroom Guy decided to stay behind. We asked him multiple times if he wanted to join us, but he insisted he was fine and didn't want to leave. After about 45 minutes of hanging out outside, we headed back inside to the dorm. As we walked up the stairs to the second floor, we smelled something before we even saw it. Turning the corner, we found Mushroom Guy lying spread eagle on the floor in the hallway, completely bare. There was feces everywhere, on the floor, on the walls. It looked like he had tried to make some sort of bizarre artwork with his own waste. When he saw us, he stood up and tried to walk over to hug us, but we quickly backed away, realizing he had poop all over his hands and chest. His friends rushed over and dragged him into the dorm room to get him in the shower. My buddy and I immediately bolted back to our room. The next morning, I heard that the RAs were furious and went door to door, threatening to test the mess for DNA unless someone came forward. Eventually, Mushroom Guy confessed and was kicked out of the dorm. Story 12. I had a dorm mate who was still a virgin, and one night, we all ended up at a frat party. He wasn't feeling great, but really wanted to go, despite his low self-confidence. At the party, he started talking to this emo/goth girl who was a bit on the chubby side. We could tell he was nervous, and knowing he wasn't in the best state to be making decisions, we tried to talk him out of leaving with her, but he was insistent. Before we knew it, he was heading out the door with her. Less than an hour later, he came back looking completely shaken. His hair was wet, his clothes were half on, and he had clearly been crying. Something had gone terribly wrong. According to him, they made it to her single dorm, and when he walked in, he noticed the bed had clear plastic sheets, which seemed odd to him but didn't raise any major red flags. They started messing around, and were getting intimate. Being already unwell, he lost control and accidentally soiled himself in the process. Mortified, he jumped off her in a panic. He turned around to see her, of all things, taking his mess and actually smearing it on herself. He was horrified and, in a complete state of shock, tied his shirt around his waist to cover up the situation, grabbed his stuff, and bolted out of the room, leaving everything else behind. He ran down to the dorm showers one floor down to clean up as best as he could, still trying to process the chaos. After rinsing himself off, he walked back to our room like nothing had happened, but we could tell something was off. We were all too uncomfortable for him to joke about it, so we just didn't mention it. We felt so bad for him that we didn't even tease him, though I think we all silently agreed it was a night he wouldn't forget anytime soon. Story 13. It was spring break during my freshman year, and in such a short amount of time, there were so many wild moments, but my favorite had to be the time a brawl broke out at one of our parties. We rented a pretty big house right on the beach in Gulf Shores, Alabama, and threw down hard all week long. One night, we decided to throw a party and invited a bunch of people from our school who were also there for spring break. Word got out, and soon, just about every college kid in that raunchy city showed up. The party was a blast, everyone was having a good time, and all was well. That is, until a large group of guys from a fraternity, I'll leave them unnamed, from Georgia Tech showed up. I don't know what their deal was, but it was clear they forgot to chill out before coming over because about 10 minutes after they arrived, they started acting like they were looking for a fight. One of my buddies, trying to keep things peaceful, stepped up and asked them to either relax or leave. Before he could finish his sentence, one of them landed a cheap right hook. And that was it. Things escalated quickly, and the whole party erupted into a full-on brawl. Of course, we all jumped in, and it was pure chaos. I remember seeing my buddy knee some guy down a flight of stairs, another friend body slamming someone into the ground. It was like a ballroom blitz, complete madness. The best part was that we were blasting classic rock at the party, so the entire fight was perfectly soundtracked by some intense guitar solos in the background, making the chaos feel even more epic. Story 14. So, freshman year, I was kind of seeing this girl who lived in my dorm. We got along pretty well and spent a lot of time fooling around, but she never really wanted to take it further. I was definitely starting to get frustrated. She was cute, and I wanted more, but it always seemed like she was holding back. One night, we went out and got completely trashed. Afterward, we stumbled back to her place, and as usual, we ended up in the shower. Both of us were beyond drunk, but we liked fooling around in there, so we did just that. I was doing my best to take things to the next level, but it just wasn't happening, and honestly, I was getting frustrated. In a moment of desperation, I decided to throw out a Hail Mary and asked her if she would actually go out with me. To my surprise, and definitely to my drunk surprise, she said yes. I couldn't believe it, but somehow, that got her to actually sleep with me. I remember being so relieved but also confused at how everything had just unfolded. The next morning, I woke up feeling like total garbage, hung over and barely remembering what had happened. As I lay there trying to piece it all together, I heard a cheerful "Good morning, boyfriend." I turned to find her lying next to me, looking all pleased with herself. My drunk brain, still foggy from the night before, must have completely missed what she said, because I responded with, "What boyfriend?" She was not happy. In fact, she was out of the room and gone in an instant, and that was the shortest relationship I've ever had. Definitely an unforgettable experience, though not for the reasons I'd hoped. Story 15. In the mid-90s, I was working for a university, installing network cards in dorm rooms as part of the upgrade to a brand new 10-100 switch network, a huge step up from the old 10-base-2 network. One day, I walked into a dorm to assist a really lovely, nice girl who needed help with her computer. I got her set up, installed the Novell Client 32 software, and connected her to the map drives. As I was working, she kept scooting closer to me, and I couldn't help but notice how wonderful she smelled. A few minutes later, her roommate came in from the shower. She took one look at me and then at her roommate, and before I knew it, she dropped her bathrobe and started walking around. I tried my best to stay professional and avoid looking, but it wasn't easy. Meanwhile, the girl I was helping, sitting right next to me so that our legs were touching, just shook her head and patted my knee. I was wearing shorts, leaving her hand there for a moment before getting up. Then things took a turn. She stood up, faced me, and unbuttoned her blouse. She only buttoned one button on her blouse after that, just one. In that moment, she was somehow way sexier than her roommate, and I couldn't help but tell her that. She smiled, said I was sweet, and handed me a $50 tip. She mentioned that her boyfriend would be there soon, and I was too confused to refuse the tip, even though I knew I wasn't supposed to accept it. As I was leaving the room, still trying to wrap my head around everything, I turned around and saw her completely take off her blouse, blow me a kiss, and close the door behind me. I was so disoriented, and to be honest, I was more than a little uncomfortable walking out of there. I could barely walk straight, and my heart was racing. A couple of months later, I ran into her again at a local pizza parlor. She was a couple of people ahead of me in line, and I didn't think she'd recognize me, so I didn't say anything. When it was my turn to order, the cashier told me my meal had already been paid for. It was such an odd and surreal moment. It was one of the strangest encounters of my life. Story 16. There was a guy in my frat who had walked onto the football team his freshman year, but ended up quitting or scrubbing out not long after. Despite that, he stayed close with a lot of the football players. He also had a friend from his hometown who was a student at our school. She was moderately attractive. The freshman 15 had definitely made its mark, but she had a very curvy figure that she always showed off. She was known for being a big partier and had a reputation for being pretty easy. Quite a few guys in my frat had hooked up with her, and they often got teased about it. The running joke was that she had STDs from messing around with Walken's football buddies, but I always figured that was just guys being obnoxious and giving each other a hard time. One summer evening, I was in our college town hanging out with Walken, and another frat bro at a house Walken was renting with some of his football buddies. We decided to keep it low-key that night, so we were drinking, playing cards, and just relaxing. A little later, girl showed up with 3 football players. I recognized her from our frat parties, and I vaguely knew the football guys through Walken. They were all linemen, big dudes, easily 300+ pounds each. They had been at a bar nearby and decided to come over. So, they all start doing their thing while we keep drinking. It was summer, and the heat was brutal. One of the football players cranked up the music, and before long, they started stripping down and dancing around. Girl joined in, stripping down as well and dancing. It wasn't like a performance or anything, but she was definitely teasing people and playfully interacting with some of us who were just sitting around. After a while, one of the football players took her to a bedroom. We could hear noises coming from the room, and we all laughed about it. Then, a couple of minutes later, the other 2 football players headed off to the same room. Me and the other frat guy looked over at Walken, and he just grinned and threw up his hands. Turns out, the rumors were true. Walken goes, "Come on, let's check this out," and heads for the bedroom door. What we saw inside was straight out of a porno movie, an absolutely wild scene. Then Walken drops his drawers, clearly planning to join in. Me and the other frat bro decided that was more than enough for us, so we left and headed to the kitchen to keep drinking. A little while later, one of the football players storms out of the room, cursing loudly and looking furious, before barging out the back door. Not long after, a second football player stumbles out, looking exhausted, and heads toward what I assumed was his bedroom. The scene unfolds as follows. The girl walks into the kitchen, grabs a bottle of alcohol, and takes a long drink. Walcon joins us and casually mentions that the third football player has passed out. We share a few shots together, chatting and hanging out, with the girl remaining there, unbothered by her lack of clothing. After some time, she turns to me and the second frat brother and says something along the lines of, "So, do you guys want to turn before I pass out?" Considering the obvious health risks and the growing unease from the familiarity of this situation, I decline, as does the second frat brother. Walcon, however, expresses his interest in another round with her, and the two of them head back to his room while we decide it's time to call it a night and head home. Story 17. I was once part of a club called High Society, which operated as a drug distribution network, unknowingly funded by the university. Each year, we'd organize a boat cruise on the river, where we'd consume large amounts while singing songs mocking the police, who would follow us along the bank, waiting for us to disembark. The key was to ensure anything illegal was disposed of before the authorities boarded the boat. I'm pretty sure our actions played a big role in the establishment of a dedicated water police division in the city. One memorable incident involved an anatomy student who stole a dong from the cadaver lab and caused a stir in a pub by floating it down the urinal, freaking out several people. He likely faced criminal charges, but somehow avoided jail time. Story 18. I was dating a girl who lived on my floor. It was a casual relationship, with lots of physical moments, but we both had roommates. We usually waited for one of us to be away on vacation, and then we'd spend the entire weekend together. One weekend, though, things took an unexpected turn. I was at a random party, dressed in a horse mask as part of a Halloween-themed gathering. A friend invited me as a plus one, and it was close enough to Halloween that it didn't seem out of place. I guess I became the center of attention, as people kept handing me drinks to drink through the mask. I ended up getting pretty drunk early in the evening. I ended up causing a bit of a mess at the party while still wearing the mask. The hosts eventually unmasked me when I passed out, and I was completely confused, not sure of where I was or what had happened. Once I regained some clarity, I left the party and made my way back to my dorm. I had some food and water to sober up, then quickly showered and brushed my teeth to make sure I was presentable. I met up with my girlfriend later, who had just finished at another party. We were both a little tipsy, and we started hanging out before our roommates returned. Things were interrupted when one of my friends, concerned about me, showed up. He wouldn't take the hint to leave, even though I appreciated his concern. Finally, he left, but right after, my roommates returned from a long study session, just wanting to sleep. We decided to pack up our things and leave. We rushed across campus to her dorm, but her roommate was already asleep. I had an adventurous idea, though. We detoured to the dorm lounge, propped a table against the door, and started to hang out. We didn't turn on the lights to avoid drawing attention, but eventually, we decided to part ways after hearing a knock on the door. The second knock was enough to make us realize we might be in trouble if there were another one. So, we quickly left, unpropped the door, and sneaked back to my dorm around 4 a.m. The next morning, my roommates were throwing a party to celebrate the long weekend. I just woke up and was still a little groggy. As I tried to talk to people, I noticed them looking at me strangely. About an hour later, my friend from the party told me I had something on my face. I rushed to the bathroom to clean up. It turned out my mouth area was stained a deep red, and as I tried wiping it off, I realized it didn't taste like ketchup at all. From then on, I was known as Redbeard and Moses for the rest of the year. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.